Hello viewers, how is everyone tonight? Today marks the second time I have attempted to stream at this later time slot for me. Welcome in, Kawaii. Thank you for always joining in. So yes, today I will be doing something very different from my other streams. Well, in a sense. I usually play games where it requires a lot of reading, but today will be the first time that I am reading an actual book. Now, a little bit of background as to why I chose this book. There's two main reasons. The first is I actually read this long ago, back in, I think it was elementary school. It must have been 5th grade. We read Murder in the Rue Morgue, and it was obviously a very edited version where all of the French words were removed, and I think it was quite a deal shorter. So I actually want to go back and read the actual story itself. The second reason is because this book is very unique in a sense in that it was the first ever true detective novel. A lot of things that you will see in here will come across as very tropey, very the expected, but that is because this novel made those things what you might expect from a typical detective story. And I find that very interesting to know the history of that, see where later detective stories actually advanced, the genre. Just need a drink of water first. And I do hope everyone in the audience has had a chance to read Edgar Allan Poe before. He is considered the first great American horror writer for a reason, but if you haven't, no shame in that. There's many wonderful authors in the world and throughout all of history. And I do plan to read more of Poe later on. I might choose a different author. I want to do at least one reading stream a week, I think. Unsure if I'll continue with the current time slot. Kawaii says, you haven't read him since middle school. Yeah, I expect a lot of even Americans won't have read much of Poe besides what was assigned to them in school, typically probably around the time of middle school. I know I read at least 3 of his works in middle school. I think The Raven and Rue Morgue were the only ones I've read in elementary school, though. I probably was assigned to read The Raven in middle and high school as well, for various assignments. That really does have to be his most famous work, the poem The Raven. It's certainly the most quoted in fiction that I know of when they want to quote some sort of classic horror. Well, let's move into another room in this cabin. One moment. There we go. Is that not a little bit more cozy? Let's see here. Now, if you are very keen-eyed, you can see that this is not actually where the story begins. I would like to say that literature has quite advanced since Poe's time. And let's see here. There are, yes, 4 pages before the story actually begins, after the title, of sort of an essay on the nature of analysis. It's a very sort of academically worded thing, and I must say I am not... I'm being pointed out something by my editor. What is going on? Uh-oh. Yes, I can see that on screen. Why is my options menu visible? Oops. Sorry, I guess you got to see a little bit behind the screens there. Behind the screen. Is my model still moving? Okay, good. I was making sure that it was still properly responding to my voice. Okay. Where was I? Yes. There's about 4 pages of preamble on a purely academic ideal of what it means to Poe to do analysis, and I am going to be skipping over that. Analysis is something that comes up in the story for sure. It is a detective novel, but not reading it is not going to affect your understanding of the story itself. So I feel it is much better to simply edit that part out. And with all of that out of the way, dear listener, let us begin Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe. And, yes, 1841 is the year of publication. Residing in Paris during the spring and part of the summer of the 1800s, all of the years I will mention in this story have been edited out unless they are explicitly a historical event. I there became acquainted with a Monsieur C. Auguste Dupin. I will do my best with the French pronunciations in the story. The young gentleman was of an excellent, indeed an illustrious family, but by a variety of untoward events he had been reduced to such poverty that the energy of his character succumbed beneath it, and he ceased to bestir himself in the world, or to care for the retrieval of his fortunes. Yes, Kawaii, I was displaying my secret sauce in the background. It's just PNG Tuber Plus, nothing very secretive. By courtesy of his creditors, there still remained in his possession a small remnant of his patrimony, and, upon the income arising from this, he managed by means of a rigorous economy to produce the necessities of life without troubling himself about its superfluities. Sorry, I know that's not even a French word, just an English word I always stumble on. Books, indeed, were his sole luxuries, and in Paris these were easily obtained. Our first meeting was at an obscure library in Rue Morgue, where the accident of our both being in search of the same very rare and very remarkable volume brought us into closer communion. We saw each other again and again. I was deeply interested in the little family history which he detailed to me with all the candor a Frenchman indulges whenever mere self is the theme. I was astonished, too, at the vast extent of his reading, and above all, I felt my soul enkindled within me by the wild fervor and vivid freshness of his imagination. Seeking in Paris the objects I then sought, I felt the society of such men would be to me, of such a man would be to me a treasure beyond price, and this feeling I frankly confided in him. It was at length arranged that we should live together during my stay in the city, and as my worldly circumstances were somewhat less embarrassed than his own, I was permitted to be at the expense of renting, and furnished in a style which suited the rather fantastic gloom of our common temper, a time-eaten and grotesque mansion, long deserted through superstitions into which we did not inquire, and tottering to its fall in a retired and desolate place in the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Kwai says, not going to lie. This feels like ancient BL. Yes, I did a pre-reading of the story yesterday, and that exactly came to mind. Had the routine of our life at this place been known to the world, we should have been regarded as madmen, although perhaps as madmen of a harmless nature. Our seclusion was perfect. We admitted no visitors. Indeed, the locality of our retirement had been carefully kept secret from our former associates, and it had been many years since Dupin had ceased to know or be known in Paris. We existed within ourselves alone. It was a freak of fancy in my friend, for what else shall I call it? To be enamored of the night for her own sake, and into this bazari, as into all his others, I quietly fell, giving myself... Hold on a sec. It's because you brought it up. I can't read this without laughing because you brought it up. Giving myself up to his wild whims with a perfect abandon. The sable divinity would not herself dwell with us always, but we could counterfeit her presence. At the first dawn of the morning, we closed all the messy shutters of our old building, lighting a couple of tapers, which, strongly perfumed, threw out only the ghastliest and feeblest of rays. By the aid of these, we then busied our souls into dreaming, reading, writing, or conversing, until we warned by the clock of the advent of true darkness. Then we sallied forth into the streets arm in arm, continuing the topics of the day, our roaming far and wide into a late hour, seeking amid the wild lights and shadows of the populous city that infinity of mental excitement which quiet observation can afford. Hawaii says they wake up at dawn together. I need another drink. At such times I could not help remarking and admitting, although from his rich ideality I had been prepared to accept it, a peculiar analytical ability in Dupin. He seemed, too, to take an eager delight in its exercise, if not exactly in its display, and did not hesitate to confess the pleasures thus derived. He boasted to me, with a low chuckling laugh, that most men, in respect to himself, wore windows on their bosom, and was wont to follow up such assertions by direct and very startling proofs of his intimate knowledge of my own. His manner at these moments was frigid and abstract. His eyes were vacant in expression, while his voice, usually a rich tenor, rose into a treble, which would have sounded petulantly, but for the deliberateness and entire distinctiveness of his enunciation. Observing him in these moods, I often dwelt meditatively upon the old philosophy of bipart soul, and amused myself with the fancy of a double Dupin, the creative and the resolvent. Let it not be supposed, from what I have just said, that I am detailing any mystery, or penning any romance, which I have described in The Frenchman. It was merely the result of an excited and perhaps of a diseased intelligence. But the character of his remarks at the periods in question, an example will best convey the idea. Kawhi says, oh my god, they're trying so hard to refute the allegations. It was the 1840s, after all. Who knows what people back then really thought of these things? I'd love to find out. Perhaps Dupin was truly a gay icon of his era. Shouldn't the old ones know? I was asleep throughout all of the 1940s. Edgar Allan Poe's life, asleep the entire time. Let's see. So yes, the example in question. We were strolling one night down a long, dirty street in the vicinity of the Palais Royal. Being both apparently occupied with thought, neither of us had spoken a syllable for 15 minutes at least. All at once, Dupin broke forth with these words. He is a very little fellow, that's true, and would do better for the Fête des Vêtements. There can be no doubt of that, I replied unwittingly, and, not at first observing, so much had I been absorbed in reflection, the extraordinary manner in which the speaker had chimed in with my meditations, and in an instant afterwards, I recollected myself, and my astonishment was profound. Dupin, said I gravely, this is beyond my comprehension. I do not hesitate to say that I am amazed and can scarcely credit my senses. How was it possible that you should know what I was thinking of? Here, I paused to ascertain beyond a doubt whether he really knew of whom I thought. Of Chantilly, said he. Oh, why do you pause? You were remarking to yourself that his diminutive figure unfitted him for tragedy. Hawaii says they're finishing each other's thoughts. They're married. That was precisely what had formed the subject of my reflections. Chantilly was a quadroon cobbler of the Rue Saint-Denis, who, becoming stage-mad, had attempted the role of Xerxes in Celebrion's tragedy, so-called, and had notoriously pasquinaded for his pains, and had been notoriously pasquinaded for his pains. I had to look this one up. Pasquinaded is French for ridiculed, as in the cobbler was ridiculed for attempting to play a role of Xerxes in the theater. I will occasionally try to chime in when very uncommon or French words show up randomly like that. Let us see. Okay, next, yes. Tell me, for heaven's sake, I exclaim, the method, if method there is, by which you have been enabled to fathom my soul in this manner. In fact, I was even more startled that I would have been willing to... In fact, I was even more startled than I would have been willing to express. It was the fruitier, replied my friend, who brought you to this conclusion, that the mender of souls was of not sufficient height for Xerxes et ingenia omnium. The fruitier? You astonish me. I know no fruitier whomsoever. The man who ran up against you as we entered the street. It may have been 15 minutes ago. I now remember that. In fact, a fruitier carrying upon his head a large basket of apples had nearly thrown me down by accident, and we passed from Rue into the thoroughfare where we stood. But what this had to do with Chantilly I could not possibly understand. There was not a particle of chartainerie about Dupin. I will explain, he said, and that you may comprehend all clearly, we will first retrace the course of your meditations, from the moment in which I spoke to you until that of rencontre with the fruitier in question. The larger links of the chain run thus: Chantilly, Orion, St. Nicholas, Epicurus, Stenormi, the street stones, the fruitier. There are a few persons who have not at some point in their lives amused themselves in retracing the steps by which particular conclusions of their own minds have been attained. The occupation is often full of interest, and he who attempts it for the first time is astonished by the apparent illimitable distance and incoherence between the starting and the goal. What, then, must have been my amazement when I heard the Frenchman speak what he has just spoken, and when I could not help acknowledging He had spoken the truth. He continued. We had been talking of horses, if I remember aright, just before leaving the street. This was the last subject we discussed, and we crossed into the street. A fruitier with a large basket upon his head, brushing quickly past us, thrust you into a pile of paving stones collected at a spot where the causeway is undergoing repair. You stepped upon one of the loose fragments, slipped, slightly strained your ankle, appeared vexed or sulky, muttered a few words, turned to look to the pile, and then proceeded in silence. I was not particularly attentive to what you did, but observation has become with me of late, a species of necessity. You kept your eyes upon the ground, glancing with a petulant expression at the holes and ruts in the pavement, so that I saw you were still thinking of stones, until we reached the little alley called the Metain, which had been paved by way of experiment with overlapping and riveted blocks. Here your countenance brightened up, and perceiving your lips to move, I could not doubt you muttered the word stereotomy, a term very affectedly applied to this species of pavement. I knew that you could not say to yourself, stereotomy, without being brought to think of atomy, and thus the theories of Epicurus. And since, when we discussed the subject not very long ago, I mentioned to you how singularly, yet with how little notice, the vague guesses of that noble Greek had met with confirmation in the late nebular cosmogony. I felt that you could not avoid casting your eyes upward to the great nebula in Orion, and I certainly expected that you would do so. You did look up, and I was now assured that I had correctly followed your steps. But in that bitter tirade upon Chantilly, which appeared in yesterday's Musée, the satirist, making some disgraceful allusions to the cobbler's change of name upon assuming the buskin, quoted a Latin line which we have often conversed. I mean the line, Peridit antiquum litera prima somnum. One sec while I put that into Google. I actually didn't look up what that line means. He ruined the old sound with the first letter. I need another drink. I expected today to be a thirsty one, so I actually brought over like two 1.5 liter jugs, one of water, one of iced tea. Sorry, I actually need to go to the BRB screen for a moment. I'll be right back. Alright, I'm back. Sorry about that. I needed to grab some chapstick. This, reading, I guess, was also drying at my lips. So yes, the Latin quote is, "He ruined the old sound with the first letter." Let's see here. I had told you that this was in reference to Orion, formerly written Orion, and from certain pungencies connected with the explanation, I was aware that you could not have forgotten it. The use of pungencies there in that sentence strikes me as odd. I wonder if it has a possible older meaning that simply has fallen out of use. It was clear, therefore, that you would not fail to combine the two ideas of Orion and Chantilly. That you did combine them, I saw by the character of your smile, which passed over your lips. You thought of the poor cobbler's immolation. So far, you had been stooping in your gait, but now I saw you draw yourself up to your full height. I was then sure that you reflected upon the diminutive figure of Chantilly. At this point, I interrupted your meditations to remark that as in fact, he was a very little fellow, that Chantilly, and he would do better at tête de variette. Oh, let's see. Sorry, I have to rearrange my UI very quickly. Okay. Not long after this, we were looking over an evening edition of the Gazette des Tribunaux when the following paragraphs arrested our attention. Kawai says, so basically he brought up Chantilly so we could say he was actually paying attention to every move his husband made. I also picked up on that. That he has been paying very close attention to his every move. Ah, how romantic. The paragraph that arrested their attention in the Gazette was, "Extraordinary murders. This morning, about 3 o'clock, the inhabitants of Quartier Saint-Roch were aroused from sleep by a succession of terrified shrieks, issuing, apparently, from the 4th story of a house in the Rue Morgue, known to be the sole occupancy of one Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter, Mademoiselle Camille L'Espanaye. After some delay, occasioned by the fruitless attempts to procure admission in the usual manner, the gateway was broken in with a crowbar, and 8 or 10 of the neighbors entered, accompanied by 2 gendarmes. By this time the cries had ceased, but as the stairs, 2 or more rough voices in angry contention were distinguished and seemed to proceed from the upper part of the house. As the second landing was reached, these sounds also had ceased, and everything remained perfectly quiet. The party spread themselves and hurried from room to room. Upon arriving at a large back chamber in the 4th story, the door of which, being found locked with the key inside, was forced open. A spectacle presented itself which struck everyone present not less with horror than with astonishment. The apartment was in the wildest disorder. The furniture broken and thrown about in all directions. There was only one bedstead, and from this the bed had been removed and thrown to the middle of the floor. On a chair lay a razor, besmeared with blood. On the hearth were 2 or 3 long, thick tresses of gray human hair dabbled with blood, and seeming to have been pulled out by their roots. Upon the floor were found 4 Napoleons, an earring of topaz, 3 large silver spoons, 3 smaller of métal d'Alger. I think the D is silent, Algier. And 2 bags containing nearly 4,000 francs in gold. The drawers of the bureau, which stood in one corner, were open, and had been apparently rifled through, though many articles still remained in them. A small iron safe was discovered under the bed, not under the bedstead. It was open, with the key still in the door. It had no contents beyond a few old letters and other papers of little consequence. Kawaii is asking, Napoleons, like the dessert? So I want to double check, but I think Napoleon at the time also refers to a gold coin. Yes, it is a gold coin. And franc, of course, is like a dollar bill. It would be a much lesser denomination. I think like 100 francs is a Napoleon. And another thing there that might be confusing for modern readers, Métal d'Alger is it's basically like a highly polished tin. It looks completely white. It can have a mirror finish. It's metal from Algeria, which is why it's called that. Of Madame L'Espanaye, no traces were seen, but an unusual quantity of soot being observed in the fireplace. Sorry, it felt like there was a word missing there. An unusual quantity of soot being observed in the fireplace. A search was made in the chimney, and horrible to relate, the corpse of the daughter, head downward, was dragged therefrom. It had been thus forced up the narrow aperture for a considerable distance. The body was quite warm. Upon examining it, many excoriations were perceived, no doubt occasioned by the violence with which it had been thrust up and disengaged. Upon the face were many severe scratches, and upon the throat, dark bruises, a deep indentation of fingernails, as if the deceased had been throttled to death. Kawaii says, "This is way more gruesome than I could have expected for a story from the 1800s. That's the thing. People have a very distanced view of the past. In the 1800s, this was... In the 1840s, this was not long after the Ripper murders of England. And in the newspapers in England, in America, they loved going into gory, gruesome detail of crimes in the newspapers. There was basically no regulation back then, so they could just print whatever they wanted. And at the advent of camera technology becoming portable, crime scene photos were very common and very popular in the newspapers. But as far as literature goes, yes, literature was considered a more noble pursuit, and so they went into less gory detail in stories, and Poe was a trendsetter in sort of breaking that idea. Let's see. After a thorough investigation of every portion of the house, without further discovery, the party made its way into a small paved yard in the rear of the building, where lay the corpse of the old lady, with her throat so entirely cut that upon an attempt to raise her, the head fell off. The body, as well as the head, was fearfully mutilated, the former so much so as scarcely to retain any semblance of humanity. To this horrible mystery, there is not as yet, we believe, the slightest clue. And you can see there a little bit of remnant of a very old way of spelling. There's a few of those in the story, but they're not very common. The next day's paper had these additional particulars. The tragedy in Rue Morgue. Many individuals have been examined in relation to this most extraordinary and frightful affair. The word affair has not yet in France the levity of import which it conveys to us. There we can see Poe actually addressing the reader themselves. But nothing whatever has transpired to throw light upon it. We give below all the material testimony elicited. Pauline Dubois, laundress, deposes that she has known both the deceased for 3 years, having washed for them during that period. The old lady and her daughter seem to be on good terms, very affectionate towards each other. They were excellent pay, could not speak in regards to their mode or means of living, believed Madame L. told fortunes for a living, was reputed to have money put by, never met any persons in the house when she called for their clothes or took them home, was sure that they had no servant in employ. There appeared to be no furniture in any part of the building except the 4th story. Pierre Moreau, tobacconist, deposes that he had been in the habit of selling small quantities of tobacco and snuff to Madame L'Espanaye for nearly 4 years, was born in the neighborhood, and has always resided there. The deceased and her daughters had occupied the house in which the corpses were found for more than 6 years. It was formerly occupied by a jeweler who underlet the upper rooms to various persons. The house was property of Madame L. She became dissatisfied with the abuse of the premises by her tenant. I tried to combine lend and tenant together. I need a drink of water. So yes, Madame L. became dissatisfied with the abuse of the house by the tenant and moved into them herself, refusing to let any portion. The old lady was childish. Witnesses have seen the daughter some 5 or 6 times during the 6 years. The witness had seen the daughter some 5 or 6 times during the 6 years. The two lived an exceedingly retired life. were reputed to have money, had heard, it said, among the neighbors that Madame L told fortunes, did not believe it, had never seen any person enter the door except the old lady and her daughter, a porter once or twice, and a physician some 8 or 10 times. Many other persons, neighbors, gave evidence to the same effect. No one was spoken of as frequenting the house. It was not known whether there was any living connections of Madame L and her daughter. The shutters of the front windows were seldom opened. Those in the rear were always closed, with the exception of a long back room, 4th story. The house was a good house, not very old. Isor Musset, gendarme, deposes that he was called to the house at 3 o'clock in the morning and found some 20 or 30 persons at the gateway endeavoring to gain admittance. Forced it open at length with a bayonet, not a crowbar. Had but little difficulty in getting it open on account of its being a double or folding gate and bolted neither at bottom nor top. The shrieks were continued until the gate was forced, and then suddenly ceased. They seemed to be screams of some person or persons in great agony, were loud and drawn out, not short and quick. Witness led the way upstairs. Upon reaching the first landing, heard 2 voices in loud and angry contention. The one a gruff voice, the other much shriller, a very strange voice. Could distinguish some words of the former, which was that of a Frenchman. Was positive it was not a woman's voice. Could distinguish the words scar and diable. Diable. I think that is the word for devil. Let me double check real quick. Everything I'm getting. Yes, sorry, old French word for devil. The shrill voice was that of a foreigner. Could not be sure whether it was the voice of a man or a woman. Could not make out what was said, but believed it to be the language of the Spanish. I said that a little weirdly, but believed the language to be Spanish. The state of the room and the bodies were described by the witness. The state of the room and bodies was described by the witness as we described them yesterday. There we go. Sorry, we got someone who has asked to be banned. Ban. There we go. I will gladly ban anyone who comes in a post-ban. Henry Duval, a neighbor, and by trade a silversmith, deposes that he was one of the party who first entered the house. Corroborates the testimony of Musette in general. As soon as they forced the entrance, they reclosed the door to keep out a crowd, which collected very fast, notwithstanding the lateness of the hour. The shrill voice, the witness thinks, was that of an Italian. Was certain it was not French. Could not be sure that it was a man's voice. It might have been a woman's, but not acquainted with the Italian language. Was not acquainted with the Italian language. Could not distinguish the words. but was convinced by the intonation that the speaker knew Italian. Knew Madame L. and her daughter had conversed with both frequently. Was sure that the shrill voice was not that of either deceased. Odenheimer, restaurateur. The witness volunteered his testimony. Not speaking French, was examined through an interpreter. Is a native of Amsterdam. Was passing through the house at the time of the shrieks. They lasted for several minutes, probably 10. They were long and loud, very awful and distressing. Was one of those who entered the building. Corroborated the previous evidence in every respect but one. Was sure that the shrill voice was that of a man, of a Frenchman. Could not distinguish the words uttered. They were loud and quick, unequal, spoken apparently in fear as well as in anger. The voice was harsh, not so much shrill as harsh. Could not call it a shrill voice. The gruff voice, repeatedly, sacré, diable, and once mon Dieu. Jules Migard, banker of the firm Migard et Fils, Rue de Lorraine, is the elder Migard. Madame L'Espanaye had some property, had opened an account with his banking house in the spring of the year, 8 years previously. Made frequent deposits in small sums, had checked for nothing until the 3rd day before her death, when she took out in person the sum of 4,000 francs. The sum was paid in gold, and a clerk went home with the money. A Dauphin Laban, clerk to Migard et Fils, deposes that on the day in question, around noon, he accompanied Madame L'Espanaye to her residence with the 4,000 francs, put up in 2 bags. Upon the door being opened, Mademoiselle L. appeared and took from his hands one of the bags. When the old lady relieved him of the other, he then bowed and departed. Did not see any person in the street at the time. It is a by-street, very lonely. William Byrd, tailor, deposes that he was one of the party who entered the house. Is an Englishman. Has lived in Paris for 2 years. Was one of the first to ascend the stairs. Heard the voices in contention. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman. Hello, the only table. I saw that you followed me, perhaps it was yesterday, after my stream. Thank you for the follow, and thank you for joining us tonight. I am the Mostly Harmless Obelisk. I mainly stream horror and mystery games, although I'm also planning to do a fantasy RPG next week, and I do once a week readings of classic literature or poems. Welcome in. I have to ask, did you happen to find me through Discord or socials, or did you find my VODs? If you wish to chat, that is. If you just wish to lurk, that's totally fine. Yeah, on Discord? Excellent. Excellent. So yes, today we are reading Murder in the Rue Morgue, a Edgar A. Poe book from the 1840s. very fascinating book, as it is, as far as I'm aware, the first detective novel ever. Have you had a chance to read it, by any chance? I'll take a moment to drink some water. Oh, I did not know that one of their songs references the book. Well, excellent. The beginning, there will be a VOD of this, of course. I can easily summarize what has happened so far. We are not super far into this. It opens with just describing the person who will be acting as the detective in the story, a Monsieur Dupin, and the narrator is his assistant. And they have read a newspaper about a horrible murder that happened in Rue Morgue, in France. And they found 2 bodies in a house, and they are now also just reading some of the testimonies that have been printed by the paper. Let's see here. So yes, they were going over the testimony of William Bird, a tailor. He says there was a sound at the moment, as if several persons struggling, a scraping and scuffling sound. The shrill voice was loud, louder than the gruff one. Is sure that it was not the voice of an Englishman. Appeared to be that of a German. Could have been a woman's voice. Does not understand German. Oh, of course, on the table. Let's see here. 4 of the above named witnesses, being recalled, deposed that the door to the chamber in which found the body of Mademoiselle L was locked on the inside when the party reached it. Everything was perfectly silent, no groans or noises of any kind upon forcing the door. No person was seen. The windows, both, closed. The windows, both, the back and front room were down and firmly fastened from within. A door between the 2 rooms was closed, but not locked. The door leading from the front room into the passage was locked, with the key on the inside. A small room in the front of the house of the 4th story, at the head of the passage, was opened, the door being ajar. This room was crowded with old beds, boxes, and so forth. These were carefully removed and searched. There was not an inch of any portion of the house which was not carefully searched. Sweeps were set up and down the chimneys. The house was a 4-story one, with garrets, a trap door on the roof, which was nailed down very securely, and did not appear to have been opened for years. The time elapsing between the hearing of the voices in contention and the breaking down of the room door, which was variously stated by the witnesses. Some made it as short as... Some said it was 3 minutes, some 5. The door was opened with difficulty. Alfonso Gracio, undertaker, deposes that he resides in Rue Morgue, is a native of Spain, was one of the party who entered the house, did not proceed up the stairs, is nervous and was apprehensive of the consequences of agitation, heard the voices in contention. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman, could not distinguish what he said. The shrill voice was that of an Englishman, is sure of this, does not understand the English language but judges by intonation. And 4 only table who has just joined. So far, every witness has said there were 2 voices in the locked room where the murder took place. Most of them say it either wasn't the 2 women who were killed who were speaking, and all of them disagree on the nationality of the people who were saying it, and some on the gender of the people saying it. Are the witnesses reliable? That's a fantastic question, and you should probably assume no. These were about 10 people who lived nearby who heard screaming coming from the room, and 2 gendarmes, sort of police, like soldier policemen, who happened upon the scene and actually broke down the gate leading up to the building. Alberto Montini, confectioner, deposes that he was among the first to ascend the stairs, heard the voices in question. The gruff voice was that of a Frenchman, distinguished several words. The speaker appeared to be expostulating, could not make out the words of the shrill voice, spoke quick and unevenly, thinks it's the voice of a Russian, corroborates the general testimony, is an Italian, never conversed with a native of Russia. Several witnesses recalled here testify that the chimneys of all the rooms of the 4th story were too narrow to admit the passage of a human being. By sweepings, we meant cylindrical sweeping brushes, such as employed by those who clean chimneys. These brushes were passed up and down every flute of the house. There is no back passage by which anyone could have descended while the party proceeded up the stairs. The body of Mademoiselle Espagnier was so firmly wedged in the chimney that it could not be gotten down until 4 or 5 party united in their strength. Kawai says the deaths were pretty gruesome. There was an old lady who had her head cut off, and her daughter who had her head shoved up a chimney. It wasn't just her head. She was in whole, shoved up through the chimney, head downward. And the old woman was found in back of the house, decapitated. Let's see. Paul Dumas, physician, deposes that he was called to view the bodies about daybreak. They were both lying on the sacking of the bedstead in the chamber where Mademoiselle L. was found. The corpse of the younger lady was much bruised and excoriated. That means covered in scrapes, abrasions, that sort of thing. The fact that it had been thrust up the chimney would sufficiently account for these appearances. The throat was greatly chafed. There were several deep scratches just below the chin, together with a series of livid spots, which were evidently the impression of fingers. The face was fearfully discolored, and the eyeballs protruded. The tongue had been partially bitten through. A large bruise was discovered upon the pit of the stomach, produced apparently by the pressure of a knee. The opinion of M. Dumas, Mademoiselle Espagnet had been throttled to death by some person or persons unknown. The corpse of the mother was horribly mutilated. All of the bones of the right arm were more or less shattered. The left tibia much splintered, as well as the ribs of the left side. Whole body dreadfully bruised and discolored. It was not possible to say how the injuries had been inflicted. A heavy club of wood, or a broad board of iron, a chair, or a large, heavy, and obtuse weapon would have produced such results, if wielded in the hands of a very powerful man. No woman could have inflicted these blows with any weapon. The head of the deceased was seen by witnesses. Head of the deceased, when seen by witnesses, was entirely separated from the body and was also greatly shattered. The throat had evidently been cut with some very sharp instrument, probably the razor. Hello, Summertime. Thank you for coming to my stream. You forgot about the grass. Okay. For those wondering, I briefly joined Summertime's stream that he was doing. I don't know pronouns for you, but Summertime was streaming earlier today, and as part of, I guess, their channel tradition, they attempt to draw from memory streamers when they join in chat, and drew me a little picture. Actually, you said that you would save it, and I have a Discord now. Anyone can feel free to join, and there's a place there to put art. If you could post that picture, that would be nice. And of course, welcome. We are reading Murder in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe, 1841. It is a classic is an understatement. It is the first, I believe, very first detective novel. To give a very brief summary, it introduced the two main characters, the narrator, and a man he is living with, a Monsieur Dupin, who will be the detectives later in the story. And right now they are reading in the newspapers about two murders that occurred one night. To give a brief summary, it is a locked room mystery on the 4th story of an otherwise empty apartment building. A girl was shoved up a chimney after being strangled, and the other woman was decapitated. Her mother was decapitated. Let's see. Summertime says, oh yeah, the older link didn't work, but you'll join now. That's odd that the older link didn't work. It should be the same one. Oh well. Let's see. Where did I leave off? In the opinion of M. Dumas, who is the attending physician for examining the bodies, Mademoiselle Espagnet had been throttled to death. Yes, I had read that. Alexandre Antony, surgeon, was called with M. Dumas to view the bodies. corroborated the testimony and opinions of M. Dumas. Nothing further of importance was elicited, although several other persons were examined. A murder so mysterious and so perplexing in all its particulars was never before committed in Paris, if indeed a murder had been committed at all. The police are entirely at fault, an unusual occurrence in affairs of this nature. There is not, however, the shadow of a clue apparent. The evening edition of the paper stated that the greatest excitement still continued in Quartier Saint-Roch, that the premises in question had been carefully researched, and fresh examinations of witnesses instituted, but all to no purpose. A postscript, however, mentions that Audifine Le Bon had been arrested and imprisoned, although nothing appeared to criminate him beyond the facts already detailed. I believe Audifine Le Bon was one of the witnesses mentioned before. Yes, a clerk. The clerk who delivered 4,000 francs to the woman who was murdered. Dupin, that is the detective from before. He's not actually a detective, he's just a sort of waifish rich man who has shut himself up in a mansion with the narrator reading and doing other frivolous activities. Dupin seems singularly interested in the progress of this affair. At least, so I judged from his manner, for he made no comments. It was only after my announcement that Le Bon had been imprisoned that he asked me my opinions regarding the murders. I could merely agree with all of Paris in considering them an insoluble mystery. I wonder if that is simply an old way of spelling unsolvable. I saw no means by which it would be possible to trace the murderer. We must not judge of the means, said Dupin. By this shell of an examination, the Parisian police, so much extolled for acumen, are cunning, but no more. There is no method in their proceedings beyond the method of the moment. They make a vast parade of measures, but not unfrequently these are so ill adapted to the objects proposed as to put us in mind of Monsieur Jourdain's calling of his robe de chambre pour minuit and Thomas la musique. And I know that must be a reference to a play. I am quickly Googling it. It is not. It is a quote, or it's just French meaning. Calling for his bathrobe so he can better hear the music. This must be a French quote that I simply am not understanding. The results attained by them are not unfrequently surprising, but for the most part are brought about by simple diligence and activity. These are qualities. When these qualities are unavailing, their schemes fail. Vidocq, for example, was a good guesser and a preserving man, but without educated thought, he erred continually by the very intensity of his investigations. He impaired his vision by holding the object too close. He might see perhaps one or 2 points with usual clearness, but in so doing, he necessarily lost sight of the matter as a whole. Thus, there is such a thing as being too profound. Truth is not always in a well. In fact, as regards the more important knowledge, I do believe that she is invariably superficial. The depth lies in the valleys where we seek her, and not upon the mountaintops where she is found. The modes and sources of this kind of error are well typified in the contemplation of the heavenly bodies. To look at a star by glances, to view it in a sidelong way, by turning towards it the exterior portions of the retina, more susceptible to feeble impressions of the light than the interior, is to behold the star distinctly, is to have the best appreciation for its luster, a luster which grows dim just in proportion as we turn our vision fully upon it. A greater number of rays actually falls upon the eye in the latter case. In the former, there is more refined capacity for comprehension. By undue profundity, we perplex and enfeeble thought. It is possible to make even Venus himself vanish from the firmament by a scrutiny too sustained, too constrained, too concentrated, too direct. Sorry, dude is too profound for me to speak correctly, apparently. I just need a moment. As for these murders, let us enter into some examinations for ourselves before we make up an opinion respecting them. An inquiry will afford us amusement. I find this an odd term, so applied, but said nothing. And besides, Le Bon once rendered me a service for which I am not ungrateful. We will go see the premises with our own eyes. I know, and for those of you who were not here at the beginning, for some reason they censored a lot of proper nouns and dates from this story. So actual street names and towns they did this. Don't know why. The prefect of the police, and shall have no difficulty in obtaining the necessary permission. The permission was obtained, and we proceeded at once to Rue Morgue. This is one of those miserable thoroughfares which intervene between Rue Richel and Rue Saint-Roch, and I don't know why they didn't censor Richel or Roche. It's an odd discrepancy to me. It was late in the afternoon when we reached it, as this quarter is at a great distance from that which we reside. The house was readily found, for there were still many people gazing upon the closed shutters with an objectless curiosity. From the opposite side of the way, it was an ordinary Parisian house with a gateway on one side of... on one side of which was a glazed watch box with a sliding panel in the window, indicating a loge de concierge. I believe this watch box with a sliding panel in the window, and by loge de concierge they mean sort of those sliding doors that you can open and someone from the outside can hand you something. Let's see. Before going in, we walked up the street, turned down an alley, and then again turning, passed in the rear of the building. Dupin, meanwhile, examined the whole neighborhood as well as the house with a minuteness of attention for which I could see no possible object. Retracing our steps, we came again to the front of the dwelling, rang, and having shown our credentials, were admitted by the agents in charge. We went up the stairs into the chamber where the body of Mademoiselle L'Espanaye had been found, and where both of the deceased still lay. The disorders of the room had, as usual, been suffered to exist. I saw nothing beyond what was stated in Gazette des Tribunaux. Dupin scrutinized everything, not excepting the bodies of the victims. We then went into the other rooms and into the yard, a gendarme accompanying us throughout. The examination occupied us until dark, and we took our departure. On the way home, my companion stepped in for a moment at the office of one of the daily papers. I had said that the whims of my friend were manifold, and that "Qu'est-ce le menace?" For this phrase, there is no English equivalent. It was his humor, now, to decline all conversation on the subject of the murder, until about noon the next day. He then asked me suddenly if I had observations of anything peculiar in the scene of the atrocity. There was nothing in his manner or emphasizing the word peculiar which caused me to shudder without... There was something in his manner of emphasizing peculiar which caused me to shudder without knowing why. "No, nothing peculiar," I said. "Nothing more, at least, than we both saw stated in the paper." "The Gazette," he replied, has not entered, I fear, into the unusual horror of a thing, but dismiss the idle opinions of this print. It appears to me that this mystery is considered insoluble, for the very reason which should cause it to be regarded as easy of solution. I mean the auteur character of its features. The police are confused by the seeming absence of a motive, not for the murder itself, but for the atrocity of the murder. They are puzzled, too, by the seeming impossibility of reconciling the voices heard in contention with the facts that no one has discovered upstairs but the assassinated Mademoiselle L'Espanaye, and that there was no means of egress without the notice of the party ascending. There were no, without the party ascending, the wild disorder in the room, the corpse thrust with head downward up the chimney, the frightful mutilation of the body of the old lady. These considerations, with just those mentioned, and others which I need not mention, have sufficed to paralyze the powers by putting completely at fault the boasted acumen of the government agents. Just need a moment. Yes, Kauai. The paragraphs are quite lengthy. The sentences quite lengthy, too, in many cases. But War and Peace was written much, much later than this book. Let's see. Kauai also says, also, there was that one witness who said these murders happened in just minutes, but there's no way that's true. That is also correct. They have fallen into the gross but common error of confounding the unusual with the obtuse. But it is by these deviations from the plane of the ordinary that reason feels its way, if at all, in its search for the true. In investigations such as we are now pursuing, it should not be so much asked, what has occurred, as what has occurred that has never occurred before. In fact, the facility with which I shall arrive or have arrived at the solution of this mystery is in the direct ratio of its apparent insolubility in the eyes of the police. I stared at the speaker in mute astonishment. I am now awaiting, continued he, looking towards the door of our apartment. I am now awaiting a person who, although perhaps not the perpetrator of these butcheries, but have been in some measure implicated in their perpetration of the worst portion of the crimes committed. It is probable that he is innocent. I hope that I am right in this supposition, for upon I build my expectation of reading the entire riddle, I look for the man here in this room every moment. It is true that he may not arrive, but the probability is that he will. Should he come, it will be necessary to detain him. Here are pistols, and we both know how to use them when occasion demands their use. I took the pistols, scarcely knowing what I did or believing what I had heard. When Dupin went on, very much as if in soliloquy, I have already spoken of his abstract manner at these times. His discourse was addressed to myself, but his voice, although by no means loud, had that intonation which is commonly employed in speaking to someone at a great distance. His eyes, vacant in expression, regarded only the wall. That the voices heard in contention, he said, by the party upon the stairs, were not voices of the women themselves, was fully proved by the evidence. This relieves us of all doubt upon the question whether the old lady could have first destroyed the daughter and afterwards committed suicide. I speak of this point chiefly for the sake of method, for the strength of Madame L'Espanaye would have been utterly unequal to the task of thrusting her daughter's corpse up the chimney as we found, and the nature of the wounds upon her own person entirely precluded the idea of self-destruction. Murder, then, has been committed by some third party, and the voices of this third party were heard in contention. Let me now advert, not to the whole testimony respecting the voices, but to what was peculiar in the testimony. Did you observe anything peculiar about it. Taking another moment. I knew this stream would be a test of endurance. Indeed, Kawaii, all that to conclude that it wasn't suicide. Thank you, Only Table. Actually, I am going to take a moment to head to the bathroom. I will be right back. Alright, and I am back. There we are. I remarked that, well, all of the witnesses agreed in supposing the gruff voice to be that of a Frenchman. There was much disagreement in regard to the shrill, or, as one individual termed it, the harsh voice. That was the evidence itself, said Dupin. But it was not the peculiarity of the evidence. You have observed nothing distinctive. Yet there was something to be observed. The witnesses, as you remarked, agreed about the gruff voice. They were not unanimous, but in regard to the shrill voice, the peculiarity is not that they disagreed whether it was an Italian, an Englishman, a Spaniard, a Hollander, and a Frenchman attempted to describe it. Each one spoke it as that of a foreigner. Each one is sure it was not the voice of one of their own countrymen. Each likens it not to the voice of an individual of any nation with whose language he is conversant, but the converse. The Frenchman supposes it was the voice of a Spaniard, and might have distinguished some words. The Dutchman maintains it to have been that of a Frenchman, but we find it stated that, not understanding French, this witness was examined through an interpreter. The Englishman thinks it was the voice of a German, but does not understand German. The Spaniard is sure it was that of an Englishman, but judges by intonation altogether, as he has no knowledge of English. The Italian believes it was that of a Russian, but has never conversed with a native of Russia. A second Frenchman differs, moreover, with the first, and is positive the voice was that of an Italian, but is not cognizant of that tongue. Is, like the Spaniard, convinced by the intonation. Now, how strangely unusual must that voice have really been about which such testimony as this could have been elicited, in whose tones even denizens of the 5 great divisions of Europe could recognize nothing familiar. You will say that it might have been the voice of an Asiatic or an African. Neither Asiatics nor Africans abound in Paris, but without denying the inference, I will now merely call your attention to 3 points. The voice is termed by one witness harsh rather than shrill. It is represented by 2 others to have been quick and unequal. No words, no sounds resembling words were by any witness mentioned as distinguishable. I know not, continued Dupin, what impression I may have made so far upon your own understanding, but I do not hesitate to say that legitimate deductions, even from this portion of testimony, the portion respecting the gruff and shrill voices, are in themselves sufficient to engender a suspicion which should give direction to all I think it's supposed to be further progresses in the investigation of this mystery. I said legitimate deductions, but my meaning is not thus fully expressed. I designed to imply that the deductions are the sole proper ones, and that the suspicion arises inevitably from them as the single result. What the suspicion is, however, I will not say just yet. I merely wish for you to bear in mind that, with myself, it was sufficiently forcible to give a definitive form, a certain tendency to my inquiries in the chamber. Kawaii says, Dupin just wants to show off. He doesn't have a clue. Maybe. I'm trying to remember. Kawaii, you said that you didn't know the story. You're not familiar with what actually occurred. I see. Well, stay tuned. You're definitely not going to guess what happens next. Let's see. Let us now transport ourselves, in the fancy, to this chamber. What shall we first seek here? The means of egress employed by the murderer? It is not too much to say that neither us believe in preternatural events. Madame and Mademoiselle L'Espanaye were not destroyed by spirits. The doors of the deed were material and escaped materially. Then how? Fortunately, there is but one mode of reasoning left upon the point, and that must lead us to a definitive decision. Let us examine, each by each, the possible means of egress. It is clear the assassins were in the room where Mademoiselle L'Espanaye were found, or at least in the room adjoining. When the party ascended the stairs, it is then only from those 2 apartments that we have to seek issues. The police have laid bare the floors and ceilings, and the masonry of the walls in every direction. No secret issues could have escaped their vigilance. But not trusting to their eyes, I examined with my own. There were then no secret issues. Both doors leading from the rooms into the passages were securely locked, with the keys inside. Let us turn to the chimney. These, although of ordinary width, for some 8 or 10 feet above the hearths, would not emit sorry, brain trying to process word. Thorough, I guess like a thoroughfare. They're extant. The body of a large cat. Okay, so a human body could not actually travel up and down the chimneys. By means already stated, being thus absolute, we are reduced to the windows. Through those of the front window, no one could have escaped without notice of the crowd from the street. The murderers must have passed then through those of the back room. Now brought to this conclusion in so unequivocal of a manner as we are, it is not our part, as reasoners, to reject it on account of apparent impossibilities. It is only left for us to prove that those apparent impossibilities are in reality not such. For those wondering, there were, on this 4th floor of the apartment, the people attempting to rescue the woman heard the voices of, as Dupin is calling them, the murderers. 2 of them, on the 4th floor. There was one staircase that goes up to the 4th floor. There are a set of windows in the front of the house, and a set of windows in the back of the house. And there were people out on the street in front of the house. So they couldn't leave through the front windows of the 4th floor, and the windows in the back of the house on the 4th floor just go straight, from out of them, go straight down 4 floors. That was something stated earlier for those who have just joined the stream. There are 2 windows in the chamber. One of them is obstructed by furniture and is wholly visible. The lower portion of the other is hidden from view by the head of an unwieldy bedstead, which is thrust close up against it. The former is securely fastened from within. It resisted the utmost force of those who endeavored to raise it. A large gimlet hole had been pierced upon its frame to the left, and a very stout nail was found fitted therein, nearly upon the head. Upon examining the other window, a small nail was seen, simply fitted in it, and a vigorous attempt to raise this sash failed also. Police were now entirely satisfied that the egress had been in these directions, and therefore it was thought a matter of supererogation. I am unfamiliar with that word, actually. I will save it for later. My own examination was somewhat more particular, and was so for all of the reasons I have just given, because here it was. I knew that all apparent impossibilities must be proved to be not such in reality. I proceeded to think thus, a posteriori. The murderers did escape from one of those windows. This being so, they could not have refascinated the sashes from the inside, as they were found fastened. The consideration which put a stop... The consideration which put a stop, through its obviousness, to the scrutiny of the police in the quarter. Yet the sashes were fastened. They must, then, have the power of fastening themselves. There was no escape from this conclusion. I stepped to the unobstructed casement, withdrew the nail with some difficulty, and attempted to raise the sash. It resisted all of my efforts, as I had anticipated. It concealed a spring must. A spring must, I know now, exist, and the corroboration of my idea convinced me that my premise, at least, were correct. However mysterious still appeared the circumstances attending to the nails. Sorry, just checking with everyone real quick. Is the text easy to see? I'm looking on my OBS right now, unsure if it's too large or too small. Maybe I can bump it up. And then I can move my set. Okay. Okay, so a concealed spring must, I know now, exist, and this corroboration of my idea convinced me that my premises, at least, were correct. However mysterious still appeared the circumstances attending the nails. A careful search soon brought to light the hidden spring. I pressed it, and satisfied with my discovery, forebode to upraise the sash. I now replaced the nail and regarded it attentively. A person passing out through the window must have reclosed it, and the spring would have caught, but the nail could not have been replaced. The conclusion was plain, and again narrowed in the field of my investigations. The assassins must have escaped through the other window. Supposing then the springs upon each sash must be the same, was probable. There must be found a difference between nails, or at least between the molds of their fixture. Getting upon the sacking of the bedstead, I looked over the headboard minutely at the second casement. Pressing my hand down between the board, I readily discovered and pressed the spring, which was, as I had supposed, identical in character to its neighbor. I now looked at the nail. It was as stout as the other, and apparently fitted in the same manner, driven in nearly up to the head. You will say that I was puzzled, but if you think so, you must have misunderstood the nature of these inductions. To use a sporting phrase, I had not been once at fault. The scent had never for an instant been lost. There was no flaw in any link of the chain. I had traced the secret to its ultimate result, and that result was the nail. It had, I say in every respect, the appearance of its fellow in the other window, but this in fact was absolute nullity, conclusive as it might seem to be. When compared with the considerations that here, at this point, terminated the clue, there must be something wrong, I said, about the nail. I touched it in the head with about a quarter inch of the shank. I touched the head with about a quarter inch of the shank. About came off in my fingers. The result, the rest of the shank was in the gimlet hole where it had broken off. Let's see here. Oh, see some stuff in chat. Only Table says absolute nullity. Yes, what a phrase. I should go through this and save a couple of these words. They're very interesting. I'd like to start using them myself. Tables okay? Got it. The fracture was an old one, for its edges were encrusted with rust, and had apparently been accomplished by the blow of a hammer, which had partially embedded in the top of the bottom sash, the head portion of the nail. I now carefully replaced the head portion to the indentation where I had taken it off, and the resemblance to a perfect nail was complete. The fissure was invisible. Pressing the spring, I gently raised the sash for a few inches. The head went up with it, remaining firm in its bed. I closed the window, and the semblance of a whole nail was again perfect. The riddle, so far, was now unriddled. The assassin had escaped through the window, which looked upon the bed, dropping of its own accord upon his exit, and perhaps purposely closed. It had been fastened by the spring, and it was the retention of the spring which had been mistaken by the police for that of a nail. Further inquiry being thus considered unnecessary. Let's see. Summertime says I'm going to sleep, but I wanted to say that the vibes in here were really immaculate. The rain was a good touch. Thank you so much, Summertime. I wish you happy sleep. The next question is that of the mode of descent. Upon this point, I had been satisfied in my walk with you around the building. Yes, good night. Good night, Summer. Upon this point, I had been satisfied in my walk with you around the building. About 5.5 feet from the casement in question, there runs a lightning rod. From this rod, it would have been impossible for anyone to reach the window itself, to say nothing of entering it. I observed, however, that the shutters of this fourth story were of a peculiar kind called by Parisian carpenters ferrades, a kind rarely employed at the present day, but frequently seen upon very old mansions at Lyon and Bordeaux. They are in the form of an ordinary door, a single, not a folded door, except that the lower half is latticed, or worked in open trellis, thus affording an excellent hold for the hands. In the present instance, these shutters are fully 3.5 feet broad. When we saw them from the rear of the house, they were both about half open, that is to say, they stood off at right angles from the wall. It was probable that the police, as well as myself, examined the back of the tenement, but if so, in looking at these facades, in the line of their breadth, as they must have done so, they did not perceive this great breadth itself, or at all events failed to take into due consideration. In fact, having once satisfied themselves that no egress could have been made to this quarter, they would naturally bestow here a very cursory examination. It was clear to me, however, that the shutter belonged to the window at the head of the bed, would, if swung fully back to the wall, reach to within 2 feet of the lightning rod. It was also evident that, by extension of a very unusual degree of activity and courage, an entrance to the window from the rod might have been thus effected. By reaching to the distance of 2.5 feet, we now suppose the shutter opens its whole extent. A robber might have taken a firm grasp upon the trellis work, letting go, then his handhold upon the rod, placing his feet squarely against the wall, and springingly broad from it, he might have swung the shutter so as to close it, if we imagine the window open at the time, might even have swung himself into the room. I wish you to bear especially in mind that I have spoken of a very unusual degree of activity as requisite to success in so hazardous and so difficult a feat. It is my design to show you first that the thing might possibly have been accomplished, but secondly and chiefly, I wish to impress upon you an understanding the very extraordinary, the almost preternatural character of that agility which could have accomplished it. You will say, no doubt, using the language of the law, that to make out my case, I should rather undervalue than insist upon a full estimation of the activity required for the matter. This may be the practice of law, but it is not the usual reason. It is not the usage of reason. My ultimate object is only the truth. My immediate purpose is to lead you to a place in juxtaposition, that very unusual activity of which I have just spoken with that very peculiar, shrill or harsh, and unequal voice, about whose nationality no two persons could be found to agree, and in whose utterance no syllabification could have been detected. At these words, a vague and half-formed conception of the meaning of Dupin filtered over my mind. I seemed to be upon the verge of comprehension without power to comprehend, as man, at times, finds themselves upon the brink of remembrance, without being able, in the end, to remember. My friend went on with his discourse. You see, he said, that I have shifted the question from the mode of egress to that of ingress. It was my design to convey the idea that both were affected upon the same manner, at the same point. Let us now revert to the interior of the room. Let us survey the appearances here. The drawers of the bureau, it is said, had been rifled through. Many articles of apparel still remained, though many articles of apparel still remained within them. The conclusion here is absurd. It is mere guess, a very silly one, and no more. How are we to know what the articles found in the drawers were not all the drawers had been originally contained? Sorry, I said that wrong. A very silly one. No more. How are we to know that the articles found in the drawers were not all the same drawers had originally contained? Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter lived in an exceedingly retired life, saw no company, seldom went out, had little use for numerous changes of habiliment. Those found were at least of a good quality, as any likely to be possessed by these ladies. Is a thief? If a thief had taken any, why did he not take the best? Why did he not take all? In a word, why did he abandon 4,000 francs in gold to encumber himself with a bundle of linen? The gold was abandoned, nearly the whole sum. Mentioned by Monsieur Migond. The banker, it was discovered in bags upon the floor. Kawaii says, that is weird, sounds like a crime of passion. Well, crimes of passion would explain the brutal treatment of the bodies, if anything. I wish you, therefore, to discard your thoughts, the blundering idea of motive engendered in our brains of those of the police by the portion of the evidence which speaks of money delivered at the door of the house. Coincidences 10 times as remarkable as this, the delivery of money and murder committed within 3 days of the party receiving it, happen all the time to us at every hour of our lives without attracting even momentary notice. Coincidences, in general, are great stumbling blocks in the way that class of thinkers who have been educated to know nothing of the theory of probabilities, that theory to which most glorious objects of human research are indebted for the most glorious of illustration. In the present instance, had the gold been gone, the fact of its delivery 3 days before would have formed something of more than a coincidence. It would have been corroborative of the idea of motive. But under the real circumstances of the case, if we are to suppose gold the motive of this outrage, we must also imagine the perpetrator so vacillating an idiot as to have abandoned the gold and his motive altogether. Keeping now steadily in mind the points to which I have drawn your attention, that peculiar voice, that unusual agility, and that startling absence of motive in a murder so singularly atrocious as this, let us glance at the butchery itself. Here is a woman strangled to death by manual strength and thrust up a chimney head downwards. Ordinary assassins employ no such modes of murder as this. Least of all do they dispose of the murdered. In the manner of thrusting the corpse up the chimney, you will admit that there was something excessively hauteur something altogether irreconcilable. Sorry. English is my first language, I just have trouble with a couple words. Irreconcilable with our common notion of human action. Even when we suppose the actors, the most depraved of men. Think, too, how great must have been the strength which could have thrust the body up such an aperture so forcefully that the united vigor of several persons was found barely sufficient to drag it down. Turn, now, to the other indications of the employment of vigor, most marvelous. On the hearth were thick trusses, very thick trusses of gray human hair. These have been torn out by the roots. They are aware of the great force. You are aware of the great force necessary in tearing thus from the head of even 20 or 30 hairs altogether. You saw the locks in question as well as myself. Their roots, a hideous sight, were clotted in fragments of the flesh of the scalp. Sure, token of prodigious power which had been exerted in uprooting perhaps 500,000 hairs at a time. The throat of the old lady was not merely cut, but the head absolutely severed from the body. The instrument was a mere razor. I wish you to also look at the brutal ferocity of these deeds, of the bruises on the body of Madame L'Espanaye. I do not speak. Monsieur Dumont and his worthy cogitator, Monsieur Etienne, have pronounced that they were inflicted with some obtuse instrument, and so far these gentlemen are correct. The obtuse instrument was clearly the stone pavement in the yard upon which the victim had fallen from the window which looked upon the bed. This idea, however simple it may now seem, escaped the police, for the same reason that the breadth of the shutters escaped them, because by the affair of the nails, their perceptions had been hermetically sealed against the possibility of the windows having been opened at all. If now, in addition to all these things, you have been properly reflected upon the odd disorder of the chamber, we have gone so far as to combine the ideas of agility astounding, a strength superhuman, a ferocity brutal, a butchery without motive, a grotesquerie and horror absolutely alien from humanity, and a voice foreign in tone to the ears of men of many nations, and devoid of all distinct and intelligible syllabification. What result, then, has ensued? What impression have I made upon your fancy? I felt a creeping of the flesh as Dupin asked me the question. A madman, I said, has done this deed. Some raving maniac escaping a neighboring maison de santé. That would be basically a madhouse, mental health ward, but of the 1800s, so basically just a stone cell. In some respects, he replied, your idea is not irrelevant, but the voices of madmen, even in their wildest paroxysms, are never found to tally with that peculiar voice heard upon the stairs. Madmen are of some nation, and their language, however incoherent in its words, has always the coherence of syllabification. Besides, the hair of a madman is not such as I now hold in my hand. I disentangled this little tuft from the rigidly clutched fingers of Madame L'Espanaye. Tell me what you can make of it. We now see that Dupin has admitted to taking evidence from the crime scene. But oh well, it's the 1800s. They basically don't have laws back then. Dupin, I said, completely unnerved. This hair is most unusual. This is no human hair. I have not asserted it is, he said. But before we decide this point, I wish you to glance at the little sketch I have here traced upon the paper. It is a facsimile drawing of which has been described in one portion of a testimony as dark bruises and deep indentations of fingernails upon the throat of Mademoiselle L'Espanaye, and in another by Dumas and Antin as a series of livid spots, evidently the impression of fingers. You will perceive, continued my friend, spreading out the paper upon the table before us, that this drawing gives the idea of a firm and fixed hold. There is no slipping apparent. Each finger has retained, possibly until the death of the victim, the fearful grasp by which it originally embedded itself. Attempt now to place all of your fingers at the same time in the respective indentations as you see them. I made the attempt in vain. We are possibly not giving this matter a fair trial, he said. The paper is spread out upon the plain surface, but the human throat is cylindrical. Here is a billet of wood, the circumference of which is about that of a throat. Wrap the drawing around it and try the experiment again. I did so, but the difficulty was even more obvious than before. This, I said, is the mark of no human hand. Read now, replied Dupin, this passage from Culliver. It was a minute, anatomical, and generally descriptive account of a large, fulvous, orange orangutan of the East Indian Islands. The gigantic stature, the prodigious strength and activity and wild ferocity, and the imitative propensities of these mammalia are sufficiently known to all. I understood the full horrors of the murder at once. The description of the digits, said I, as I made an end of the reading, is in exact accordance with this drawing. I see that no animal but an orangutan of the species here mentioned could have impressed the indentations as you have traced them. This tuft of tawny hair, too, is identical in character with the best of Culliver, but I cannot possibly comprehend the particulars of this frightful mystery. Besides, there were two voices heard in contention, and one of them was unquestionably the voice of a Frenchman. True, and you will remember an expression attributed most unanimously by the evidence to this voice the expression mon Dieu. Thus, under the circumstances, has been justly characterized by one of the witnesses, Monty the confectioner, as an expression of remonstrance or expultation. Upon these two words, therefore, I have mainly built my hopes of a full solution of the riddle. A Frenchman was cognizant of the murder. It is possible, indeed, it is far more than probable, that he was innocent of all participation in the bloody transactions that took place. The orangutan must have escaped from him. He must have traced it to the chamber, but under the agitating circumstances which ensued, he could never have recaptured it. It is still at large. I will not pursue these guesses, for I have no right to call them more, since the shades of reflection upon which they are based are scarcely of sufficient depth to be appreciated by my own intellect, and since I should not pretend to make them intelligible to the understanding of another, we will call them guesses then, and speak of them as such. If the Frenchman in question is indeed, as I suppose, innocent of the atrocity, this advertisement which I left last night upon our returning home at the office of Le Monde, a paper devoted to our shipping interest, which and most sought by sailors, will bring him out to our residence. He handed me the paper, and I read thus: caught in the Bois de Boulogne, early in the morning of something instance, the morning of the murder, a very large tawny orangutan of the Borneo species, the owner, who was ascertained to be a sailor belonging to a Maltese vessel, may have the animal again upon identifying it sufficiently and paying a few charges arising from its capture in keeping. Call this number at this location in Freiburg, Saint-Germain. Ottimo. Kawai says, "You're right, I couldn't have guessed this." Yes, so this was, again, the first detective novel, and the idea of a detective novel being something where the reader participates in solving the murder alongside the detective or the detective's assistant was not something that had come about yet. I believe that might have been an Arthur Conan Doyle invention, the Sherlock Holmes books, but it might have come sooner. But it certainly came later than this one. Absolutely no one would have guessed orangutan from the clues. "How is it possible," I asked, "that you should know the man to be a sailor and belonging to a Maltese vessel?" "I do not know it," Dupin said Dupin. "I am not sure of it. Here, however, is a small piece of ribbon, which, from its form and from its greasy appearance, has evidently been used for the tying of the hairs in one of those long queues of which sailors are so fond." I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding that. I'm guessing tying up hair is what he's saying here. "Moreover, this knot is one of those few besides sailors can tie, and is peculiar to the Maltese. I have picked the ribbon up at the foot of the lightning rod. It could not have belonged to either of the deceased. Also, I am wondering how he identified a knot to be specifically from Malta. That's a very strange guess. Now, if after all I am wrong in my induction from this ribbon that the Frenchman was a sailor belonging to a Maltese vessel, still, I can have done no harm in saying what I did in the advertisement. If I am in error, he will merely suppose that I had been misled by some circumstance, into which he will not take trouble to inquire. But if I am right, a great point is gained. Cognizant, although innocent of the murder, the Frenchman will naturally hesitate about replying to the advertisement, about demanding the orangutan. He will reason thus: I am innocent, I am poor, my orangutan is of great value to one in my circumstance, a fortune itself. Why should I lose it through idle apprehension of danger? Here it is within my grasp. It was found in the Bois de Boulogne, at a vast distance from the scenery of the butchery. How could it even be suspected that a brute beast should have done the deed? The police are at fault. They have failed to procure the slightest clue. Should they even trace the animal, it would be impossible to prove me cognizant in the murder, or to implicate me in guilt on account of that cognizance. After all, I am known. The advertiser designates me the possessor of the beast. I am not sure to what limit his knowledge may extend. Should I avoid claiming a property of so great value, which it is known that I possess, I will render the animal, at least, liable to suspicion. It is not my policy to attract attention either to myself or to the beast. I will answer the advertisement, I will get the orangutan, and I will keep it close until this matter has blown over. I need another drink. And do know, dear viewer, we are reaching near the end of the story. Be ready, said Dupin. With these pistols, with your pistols, but neither use them nor show them until at the signal for myself. The front door of the house has been left open, and the visitor had entered without ringing, and advanced several steps upon the staircase. Now, however, he seemed to hesitate. Presently, we heard him descending. Dupin was moving quickly to the door when we heard him coming up. He did not turn back a second time, but stepped with decision and rapped at the door of our chamber. "Come in," said Dupin, in a cheerful and hearty tone. A man entered. He was a sailor, evidently, a tall, stout, muscular-looking person, with a certain daredevil expression of countenance, not altogether unprepossessing. His face, greatly sunburnt, was more than half hidden by whisker and mustachio. He had with him a huge oaken cudgel, but appeared to be otherwise unarmed. He bowed awkwardly and bade us good evening in French accent, which was somewhere Neufwashi? Faustus. Were we still sufficiently indicative of a Parisian origin? I'm unfamiliar with how to actually say that word, but I do know that this Nufas is sort of like eastern France on the border with Germany. I believe that's where it is. Sit down, my friend, said Dupin. I suppose you have called about the orangutan. Upon my word, I almost envy you the possession of him. A remarkably fine and no doubt very valuable animal. How old do you suppose him to be? The sailor drew a long breath, and with an air of a man relieved of some intolerable burden, then replied in an assured tone, I have no way of telling, but he can't be more than 4 or 5 years old. Have you got him here? Oh no, we have no conveniences for keeping him here. He is at a livery stable in Rue du Bourg, just by. You can get him in the morning. Of course. Are you prepared to identify the property? To be sure I am, sir. I shall be sorry to part with him, Dupin said. I don't mean that you should be at all with this trouble for nothing, sir, said the man. Couldn't expect it. I'm very willing to pay a reward for finding of the animal. That is to say, anything in reason. Well, replied my friend, that is all very fair, to be sure. Let me think. What should I have? Oh, I will tell you, my reward shall be this. You shall give me all the information you have in your power about these murders in Rue Morgue. Dupin said these last words in a low tone, and very quietly. Just as quietly, too, he walked towards the door, locked it, put the key in his pocket, and drew a pistol from his bosom, and placed it, without the least flurry, upon the table. The sailor's face flushed up, as if he were struggling with suffocation. He started to his feet and grasped the cudgel, but the next moment he fell back into the seat, trembling violently, and with the countenance of death itself. He spoke not a word. I pitied him with the bottom of my heart. My friend, said Dupin, in a kind tone, you are alarming yourself unnecessarily. You are indeed. We mean you no harm whatsoever. I pledge you the honor of a gentleman and of a Frenchman, that we intend you no injury. I perfectly well know that you are innocent of the atrocities in Rue Morgue. It will not do, however, to deny that you are in some measure implicated in them. From what I have already said, you must know that I have the means of information about the matter, means of which you could never have dreamed. Now the thing stands thus. You have done nothing which you could have avoided. You have done nothing which you could have avoided. Nothing, certainly, which renders you culpable. You are not even guilty of robbery, when you might have robbed with impunity. You have nothing to conceal. You have no reason for concealment. On the other hand, you are bound by every principle of honor to confess all you know. An innocent man is now imprisoned, charged with that crime of which you can point out the perpetrator. The sailor has recovered his presence of mind in a great measure, while Dupin uttered these words, but his original boldness was bearing with all. The original boldness of bearing was all gone. So help me God, he said after a brief pause. I will tell you all that I know about the affair, but I do not expect you to believe one half I say. I would be a fool indeed if I did. Still, I am innocent, and I can make a clean breast of it, if I die for it. What he stated was, in substance, thus. He had lately made a voyage to the Indian archipelago, a party of which he formed one, landed in Borneo, and passed into the interior on an excursion of pleasure. Himself and a companion captured an orangutan. This companion, dying, the animal fell into its own exclusive possession. After great trouble, occasioned by the intractable ferocity of his captive during the home voyage, he at length succeeded in lodging it safely in his own residence in Paris, where, not to attract towards himself the unpleasant curiosity of his neighbors, he kept it carefully secluded until such time as it should be recovered from a wound in its foot, received from a splinter on board ship. His ultimate design was to sell it. Returning home from some sailor's frolic the night, or rather in the morning of the murder, he found the beast occupying his own bedroom, into which it had broken from a closet adjoining, where it had been, as well, though secretly confined. Where it had been, as was thought, secretly confined. Razor in hand, and fully lathered, it was sitting before a looking glass attempting the operation of shaving, in which it had no doubt previously watched its master through the keyhole of the closet. Terrified at the sight of so dangerous a weapon in the possession of an animal so ferocious, and so well able to use it, the man, for some moments, was at a loss of what to do. He had been accustomed, however, to quiet the creature, even in its fiercest of moods, by the use of a whip, and to this he now resorted. Upon sight of it, the orangutan sprang at once through the door of the chamber, down the street, and thence through a window, unfortunately open into the street. Yes, Kawaii, this is, crazy ending. Almost done. The Frenchman followed in despair. The ape, razor in hand, occasionally stopped to look back and gesticulate at its pursuer, until the latter had nearly come upon it. It then made off. In this manner, the chase continued for a long time. The streets were profoundly quiet, as it was nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. In passing down an alley in the rear of Rue Morgue, the fugitive's attention was arrested by the light gleaming from the open window of Madame L'Espanaye's chamber in the 4th story of the house. Rushing to the building, it perceived the lightning rod, clambered up with inconceivable agility, grasped the shutter, which was thrown fully back against the wall, and by its means swung itself directly upon the headboard of the bed. The whole feat did not occupy a minute. The shutter was kicked open again by the orangutan as it entered the room. The sailor, in the meantime, had both rejoiced and perplexed. He had strong hopes now of recapturing the brute, as it could scarcely escape from the trap which it had ventured, except by the rod, where it might be intercepted as it came down. On the other hand, there was much cause for anxiety, as to what it might do to the house. The later reflection urged the man to still follow the fugitive. A lightning rod is ascended without difficulty, especially by a sailor. But when he had arrived at as high as the window, which lay far to his left, his career was stopped. The most he could accomplish was to reach over so as to obtain a glimpse of the interior of the room. At this glimpse, he nearly fell from his hold through the excess of horror. Now it was that those hideous shrieks arose upon that night, which had startled from slumber the inmates at Rue Morgue. Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter, habitated in their night clothes, had apparently been occupied in arranging some papers in an iron chest already mentioned, which had been wheeled into the middle of the room. It was open, and its contents lay beside it on the floor. The victims must have been sitting with their backs to the window, and from the time elapsing between the ingress of the beast and the screams, it seems probable that it was not immediately perceived. The flapping of the shutters would naturally have been attributed to the wind. Let's see. Kawaii says, orangutan just wanted to groom itself. A shaved orangutan is not something my imagination easily conjures. And you know this is slander. Orangutans aren't even usually violent. That is actually true. Most primates can exhibit violence, but certainly don't go out of their way to attack other things, especially humans. However, this is not an actual inaccurate depiction, as you will soon see. Much later, or at the very end, my document says we have less than 2 pages left. As the sailors looked in, the gigantic animal had seized Madame L'Espanaye by her hair, which was loose as she had been combing it, and was flourishing the razor about her face in imitation of the motions of a barber. The daughter lay prostrate and motionless. She had... That's a weird use of this word. Maybe I'm not completely... Maybe I don't know every way that the word swooned could be used, but I would not use it here. The screams and struggles of the old lady, during which her hair was torn from her head, had the effect of changing the probably pacific purposes of this orangutan into those of wrath. With one determined sweep of its muscular arm, it nearly severed her head from her body. The sight of blood inflamed its anger into frenzy, gnashing its teeth and flashing fire from its eyes. It flew upon the body of the girl and embedded its fearful talons into her throat, retaining its grasp until she expired. Its wandering and wild glances fell at this moment upon the head on the bed, over which the face of its master, rigid with horror, was just discernible. The fury of the beast, who no doubt bore still in mind the dreaded whip, was instantly converted into fear. Conscious of having deserved punishment, it seemed desirous of concealing its bloody deeds. and skipped about the chamber in agony of nervous agitation, throwing down and breaking the furniture as it moved, and dragged the bed from its bedstead. In conclusion, it seized first the corpse of the daughter, thrust it up the chimney, as it was found, then that of the old lady, which it immediately hurled through the window headlong. As the ape approached the casement, kawaii, she swooned is certainly a statement to make. As the ape approached the casement with its mutilated burden, the sailor shrank, aghast to the rod, and rather gliding than clambering down it, hurried at once home, dreading the consequences of the butchery, and gladly abandoning, in his terror, all solicitude about the fate of the orangutan. The words heard by the party upon the staircase were the Frenchman's exclamations of horror and affright, commingled with the fiendish jabberings of the brute. I have scarcely anything to add. The orangutan must have escaped from the chamber by the rod just before breaking of the door. It must have closed the windows as it passed through it. It was subsequently caught by the owner himself, who obtained it for a very large sum at the Jardin des Plantes. Let's see. Sorry, I am rereading that statement. It was subsequently caught by the owner himself, who obtained it for a very large sum at Jardin des Plantes. The Don was instantly released. Oh, okay, so this is all taking place in the future, after the man was interrogated. Okay. So the beast was caught. The Don was instantly released upon our narration of the circumstances, with some comments from Dupin at the bureau of the prefect of police. This functionality, however, well disposed to my friend, could not altogether conceal his chagrin at the turn of which affairs had taken, and was fain to indulge in sarcasm or two about the propriety of every person minding his own business. "Let him talk," said Dupin, who had not thought it necessary to reply. "Let him discourse. It will ease his conscience. I am satisfied with having defeated him in his own castle. Nevertheless, that he failed in the solution of this mystery is by no means that matter for wonder which he supposes it. For, in truth, our friend the prefect is somewhat too cunning to be profound. In this wisdom is no stamen. In this wisdom is no stamen. It is all head and no body, like the pictures of the goddess Laverna, or, at best, all head and no shoulders, like a codfish. But he is a good creature after all. I like him especially for one master stroke of cant, by which he has never attained his reputation for ingenuity. I mean by way of tenir si que est et de expilia siqui, n'est-ce pas? I will run that through a translator. and that is to deny what is and to explain what is not. Okay. Yes, that is where it ends. Oof, that was quite an endurance of reading. Let me take us back to our normal Yap screen. There we go. That's a bit more comfortable. Oh boy. Okay. So, that story. Lots of elements you can see there that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle expanded on and have been pretty much shown up in the vast majority of detective and mystery novels. We see the main character or main detective favoring their intelligence and powers of observation. We see the bumbling detective, or the bumbling police. We see an idea of intelligence being greater than power. The beast, the orangutan being the probably like most example of a purely strength sort of villain. Let's see here. Table says, woo, that was a comfy read to listen to. Thank you very much for the compliment. We also see some of the things in detective novels like, it is narrated from the perspective of a follower or an assistant of the detective rather than the detective himself. I think that I actually do like that. Of course, I would most like for that to be mixed up from time to time. And we also see a mystery where we cannot possibly know how it could be solved or who the villain is until the very end. Those are my least favorite type of mystery novels. What did the rest of you think about the story itself? Let's see, Table says, I liked the details described about the chimney, a lot to envision. Yes, Poe is very good at detail work. And yes, I loved how gruesome this story was. He did a very good job with describing the murder scene. Kawaii says, story was hilarious at the end, and I liked the misunderstanding over the race of the culprit. I did like that. Actually, that's something that I wish would happen more, not specifically that everyone was, they couldn't identify the race of the culprit, but that when they were going over the newspaper, there were the statements people had given that the newspaper was printing, and we actually got to see like the testimonies presented in that way. I really liked that as a change of pace from some of the other mystery stories I've been seeing recently. And yes, there were some pretty funny parts. And some parts at the beginning. I don't think you were there yet, Only Table, but before it actually got to the mystery, the story was pretty gay. Like, kind of shockingly subtext-y. Yeah. Yeah, Ancient BL, for real. I don't know if people back then actually, like, gay people back then actually saw this as gay subtext, but I don't know. No, I'm pretty sure in the 1800s, no one had time for anything. I think that's like the main thing about the 1800s and the Industrial Revolution as a whole. Well, I narrated for about 3 hours. That is a new record for me and bodes well for these reading streams that I've been wanting to do. Honestly, I was kind of looking forward to this more than I was some of the gaming streams I was planning. I've also been wanting to do some other kinds of streams as well. I don't know how I would do it because I don't have a good camera, but I kind of want to do a hand cam stream where I build Gunpla. I have a couple Neon Genesis Evangelion Gunpla that I've been wanting to put together, also a 30-minute sister me and my wife bought, which maybe I would put that together on stream as well. That might be interesting, but maybe something that I'd have to wait a while for until I actually buy some equipment. What else? I've also been wanting to read poetry on stream, of course. That should be easy compared to a full story like this. And also, of course, creepypasta and urban legends. I've been wanting to read those. And actually, on that topic, I did it originally was going to be a YouTube short. I wrote my own short story and recorded it and put it up on my YouTube channel. And if you go into my Discord, I have a link there to my YouTube channel. Oh wait, I don't think I actually have it up yet. I gotta do that ASAP after the stream ends, is put my YouTube channel link on there. I also really should put my YouTube link down on my links page. Yeah, I don't have that either on my Twitch. I am lacking right now, so I gotta go fix that. So yeah, if you're interested in my own short story I wrote, I can actually just post a link directly to it in chat. And I think we're getting to the point where I should be looking for someone who I could raid us into. Oh, and of course, the YouTube video. Thank you very much to my wife, Kawaii, who helped do the editing of the story itself and some video production work. Couldn't have done it without you. Okay, I found someone for us to raid into. Let me just type out this message. If you wish to join in the raid, you can copy paste that into their stream. Raid. There we go. Thank you to everyone who came by, and especially to those who, entered the chat room, chatted with me. I had a lot of fun tonight. I really want to do this again next week. And the next stream we have is going to be Sunday at 11:30 p.m. EST. I have not determined what we'll be doing then. I was going to originally do Cultist Simulator, but for reasons that I posted about on Twitter, And on Blue Sky, we will not be doing Cultist Simulator streams for quite a while. Let's see. So I'll have to pick out a game. I guess I'll keep it secret until the day of. Thank you so much for dropping by, Table. And I hope everyone has a wonderful night.